Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this webinar on the Islamic State. I am joined by four fabulous panelists whose expertise varies from Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. We have two recent authors of a book, The ISIS Reader, along with the third co-author, and Cole Bunzel joining us from California. Just to introduce you briefly to our panelists, we have Cole Bunzel, as I mentioned, who is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and an editor of the blog Jihadika. He's currently working on a book on the history and doctrine of Wahhabism. Emily Estelle is a research manager for the Critical Threats Project at AEI. She's a senior analyst and leads the Africa research team and coordinates with the Institute for the Study of War on the Salafi Jihadi team. And then Horor Ingram is a senior research fellow with the George Washington University's program on extremism. He's conducted field research in the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned, is a co-author of the ISIS Reader, along with Craig Whiteside, who is an associate professor at the Naval War College at the Postgraduate School, and is also a fellow at GW's program on extremism and at the International Center for Counterterrorism at The Hague. Today, if you are looking to submit questions to our webinar, please use the hashtag ISISFuture and email Jacqueline Dirks, whose email you can find on the event webpage that you registered at. We are going to be discussing how the Islamic State came to be, how we should have understood the organization based on its writings and its statements, and what it has been doing on the ground, and then talking a little bit about what's coming next with the Islamic State and whether the United States has actually declared victory against this organization too soon. So the big policy question that we're trying to answer is whether we, the United States and frankly the West, should be understanding this group a little bit differently in terms of what victory against it means when we're trying to decide what resources we should be putting against it. So 6 years ago, around this time, Abu Bakr al Baghdadi delivered his first sermon as Caliph in the newly minted Islamic State. We now have a new Caliph in place. He has taken the robe of Baghdadi, though he is much less visible as a leader, and people talk about that as a vulnerability today. When we're talking about the Islamic State, it actually stretches now across the Muslim world, a far change from what it was in 2013 when the Islamic State was first declared, and even a greater geographic expanse than the Islamic State had at the height of its power in 15 and 16. The challenge that we're facing is the US and the West are looking to draw down on counterterrorism against the Islamic State, and there's certainly a shift in the American military posture and the posture of our partners abroad, along with the resources that we're dedicating to this problem. Meanwhile, the Islamic State talks about its victory much differently than we do. And when members of the Islamic State talk about victory, they either talk about achieving their goals or dying. That's very, very different from what the United States says, where we're looking to simply defeat the threat from the organization, and then preserve our resources and move on to the next problem. So I wanted to start actually with Cole here and ask him to set the scene for us, because the Islamic State didn't simply arrive in 2013 or 2014 when the rest of the world started paying attention, or even in 2003 when Al-Qaeda in Iraq began to operate. Cole, you've written at length about the ideological underpinnings of the group, the Islamic State, and also of the broader Salafi Jihadi movement. Where does the Islamic State come from, and what makes it so different?
Hi, Katie, and thanks for having us. So I think there are kind of two ways to look at the history of the Islamic State. There's an organizational level and an ideological level. So organizationally, the Islamic State traces its own history, and this is in its own discourse, back to October 2006. When it declared the founding of what was known as the Islamic State of Iraq, Dawlat al-Iraq al-Islamiyya, which was founded by both Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the group at the time that was led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, or actually Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had just recently died, and a number of other jihadi groups. So when you listen to the speeches of the Islamic State's leaders, and you read their media outlets, they often talk about their history going back to 2006. And even though a lot of Western analysts and Middle Eastern analysts tended to refer to the Islamic State of Iraq by the name Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in fact, the group, according to its own messaging, had deemed al-Qaeda in Iraq to have disappeared beginning in October 2006, having been replaced by the Islamic State of Iraq, which was, as it put it, a kind of statehood project. And it also had at the very beginning this anticipation to become the caliphate. It cast itself as the kernel of a future caliphate that would ultimately expand and dominate across the globe. Although that was a very delayed expansion, when the Islamic State of Iraq expanded into Syria as they understood it to have happened in April 2013, becoming ISIS, that was sort of the fulfillment of the original idea behind the Islamic State of Iraq. And then when they declared the caliphate in June 2014, a year later, that was the further fulfillment of the original mission to become the caliphate. So that is sort of one way to look at the history. The other way is with regard to ideology. And in my opinion, the man who was sort of the ideological forebear of the Islamic State was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the Jordanian jihadi leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. He represented a more severe, a more hardline version of Sunni jihadism, or what we call jihadi Salafism or Salafi jihadism. It's a movement, this is a movement that admits of a range of theological and ideological tendencies, and he represented the most severe, the most unforgiving version of it. So for example, he believed that the Shia were not Muslims, whereas the leader of Al-Qaeda told him, no, they actually are Muslims who are to be excused on the basis of ignorance, and these sort of differences. So he, in kind of articulating a more theologically exclusivist version of jihadism, he harkened back to the Wahhabi tradition in Saudi Arabia as it was originally kind of marketed in the 18th century, which was very focused on the doctrine of takfir, excommunication, and kind of forming a very small tent of Muslims, whereas Al-Qaeda has, especially recently, been kind of selling itself as a pan-Islamist group that believes in a big tent jihadism, where just all kinds of groups can be admitted, including the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, whose leaders it has celebrated. So that's the main element, I think, of its ideology, is the theological exclusivism that sets it apart from Al-Qaeda. But there's also, I think you alluded to this, the barbarity and the extreme violence of the group. That's also something that differentiates it from Al-Qaeda. And that was a method, I believe, that was pioneered by Zarqawi as well, who appeared in a video beheading an American journalist. So he pioneered a lot of this emphasis on gruesome videos, something that Al-Qaeda has dismissed as a kind of Hollywoodization of jihad. And then thirdly, a real pillar that has emerged in the ideology of the Islamic State is the Islamic State itself, the idea that it is the caliph, the caliphate, and that all other organizations, jihadi organizations, are invalid, and that all Muslims are obliged to pledge fealty or bay'ah to the group. So you bring all those things together, you have a kind of theological exclusivism and an organizational exclusivism, and that's how you get ISIS.
Thank you. And just to follow up briefly, I think you know this well, but just for the public that's listening, when you're talking about the ideology, we refer to the Islamic State as being more extreme, more radical than Al-Qaeda, but in framing it that way, it tends to make Al-Qaeda seem more moderate. But from my understanding, especially from your work, they are aiming at the same goals, right?
Yeah, if I say that Al-Qaeda is relatively moderate, it's not to say that they're better. They're just as evil, and in fact, they could be a greater threat by being, say, less extreme with regard to theological differences between Sunni and Shia. So these are terms, and I borrow these terms also from their own discourse. They use words like extremism and Harajism to define and differentiate themselves. So yeah, it's no credit to Al-Qaeda to be a little bit to the left of ISIS.
Super. So Hararo, Cole has laid out kind of the ideological underpinnings that have differentiated the Islamic State from Al-Qaeda and from the rest of the Salafi jihadi movement writ large. And from your research, I know that you know this well, but how did the group start to operationalize its ideology, and what made it become so successful so quickly? And then, how are you seeing the group talk about its successes and failures?
Sure. Well, yeah, again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Look, there's a range of ways, I guess, that we can kind of try to answer that question. And you speak to different people with different kind of perspectives. They're going to provide a different angle to this. And I guess from my perspective and from the perspective that we took for the ISIS reader, there's really something to this movement's strategic culture and its strategic kind of practice that I think is really important. Taking what are largely abstract kind of ideas and notions in the ideological kind of jurisprudential kind of realm, and the kind of things that you're going to need to do on a day-to-day basis to try to achieve that and kind of bring them together. And this is where that strategic mechanism is really important. And I guess what we've kind of traced, and we really tried to trace this with the book, was how strategic practice evolved over a period of decades, how that then fueled a kind of a strategic culture within the movement. That is how individuals and how teams approach these questions. And it kind of gets you kind of stuck into this loop, really, that the culture helps to inform the practice, but the practice helps to inform the strategic culture that emerges. How do we take these high abstract ideas and with actions and messaging that we engage in the short to medium term to try and achieve these larger goals? And I think that mix of strategic culture and practice is really important. So kind of broadly, what's kind of characterized this within the Islamic State? Well, obviously, the kind of concepts which Cole spoke about are really important. There's also this idea of manhaj, this idea of methodology for achieving it, that is really central to how it thinks about strategy, how it kind of calibrates and steadies the ship through the tough times, and then kind of looks to take advantage during those periods, those very fleeting short periods of success. And so what we noticed throughout kind of tracking this movement from the 90s is just they are surprisingly frank about how they assess not only their capabilities and capacity, but also that of their adversaries. They're surprisingly self-critical. I say surprising because it's kind of a weird bar to kind of use, but you may not really expect them to be critical and reflective at times, particularly when times are bad, as they are. They demonstrate a relatively methodical approach to assessing risk and threat, but also the environment. Different players in this context. How do we use both violence and brutality that is timed and decisive, but also how do we use politics, top-down politics? How do we reach out to local leaders, local tribal leaders? In the case of, I've seen in Southeast Asia, reaching out to business leaders even. How do we use governance in a bottom-up kind of sense? How do we exploit vulnerabilities and leaders and those levers? But how do we also assess our strengths compared to our adversary's strengths? There also appears to be this real appreciation, not just for tactical and operational aims and even strategic aims in a strict sense, but also the way that actions and messaging can be calibrated in such a way to change the conditions, to change the conditions within which the group is seeking to operate. And I think this is really important. It's really important to understand that they don't kind of have this idea of this pursuit of, say, perfection in operations or perfection in strategy, but rather that we need to, despite the rhetoric, but that we need to outcompete our adversaries. And so as we track the movement through the book, this emerges is quite clear. It's hard to avoid when you look at, for example, their internal doctrine and communicators. You look at Zarqawi's letter to Al-Qaeda leadership that was captured in January 2004. You know, you see this surprising degree of patience. You see this appreciation, either directly from him or him and his inner circle, that a window was closing, that there was this opportunity and it needed to be exploited in a timely and decisive fashion. You see an appreciation in that letter for the role that messaging plays to amplify actions, but also to nullify the effects of adversaries. Abu Hamza al-Muhajir's advice for the leaders and commanders and soldiers of the Islamic State, a 2007 or 8 document. You see there an appreciation for how strategy can't just be this thing that leaders talk about, that command talks about. It's got to go all the way down to your people on the ground. It has to be operationalized in a very tangible, real kind of sense, that root to fruit kind of idea. The Fallujah Memorandum is a great example, really a blueprint document for how the movement is to reemerge again. The speeches by its leaders, you know, we feature a lot of these speeches. In those speeches, you see the way that strategic culture and practice, it isn't just implied and hinted to, it's kind of demonstrated in the way that the group tries to inform its audiences. You know, whether it's Baghdadi's declaration that the group had moved into Syria, whether it's Adnani's that they live by proof, which essentially defines how the group thinks about success and failure, or even Baghdadi's final speech, where, you know, this was a lot more than just a proof of life video. This was a proof of engagement. It was a proof of his awareness. It was a proof of his of his kind of strategic thinking. Now, I don't want this to be misconstrued in any way. You know, these aren't strategic geniuses, as we say quite a bit. They're strategic plagiarists. You know, they are far from perfect. They make mistakes. They are hypocrites. And perhaps later on we can talk about how we can be much better at exploiting those weaknesses. But I really think it's important for us to think about the way that strategic practice and the culture around that practice has evolved over time, and how important it's been for turning abstract ideas and concepts into reality.
Thank you. I think that's fascinating to think about, especially as we're looking at kind of what's coming next. So Harari, you mentioned this in your remarks just now, but the Fallujah Memo, you know, I read, Craig, in your book, along with, I guess, Charlie Winter was also a co-author with it. But the Fallujah Memo is a document that really stood out to me as an analyst, because when I read through it, and having now, you know, I've got 20/20 hindsight, right? And you see the Islamic State literally talk about its strategy for the upcoming phased campaign. And it played it out very, very closely to what it had said it was going to do. So, you know, Craig, I understand that the premise of the reader, the ISIS reader, is really to kind of take a step back and try to understand the Islamic State as an organization through its own words. The same way that we've seen individuals try to go back and look at Al-Qaeda and what it has been trying to achieve through the statements of its leaders. The three of you tried to pull together the same sort of compendium for the Islamic State. And, you know, the Fallujah Memo was written, you're going to correct me, but 2008 or 2009, and posted on a jihadi forum. And, you know, I hadn't heard of it until I had seen it posted or published in your book. You know, should the United States have taken that sort of framing more seriously? And what does that mean for some of the discussion and statements that we're seeing today that we're so ready to dismiss, saying that, you know, the Islamic State or other groups like it don't have the capabilities to achieve that, but they've laid out a strategic vision and plan to do so? Craig, do you want to unmute yourself? It had to happen.
Thank you. Sorry, of course. So the Fallujah Memorandum is a good reflection of what Harari was talking about that strategic culture that evolves. And you're right, it's easy now in hindsight to look at this document and say, well, they actually had a plan. I'll start my thoughts on this document and the ISIS reader with our perceptions, right? The period of 2008 to 13 is really ignored by a lot of scholars, books on the movement's history. It kind of jumped from Zarqawi all the way to 2013 and the caliphate. And I'd say with the exception of maybe Brian Fishman, who was writing articles at the time saying, the attack data still says there's a viable insurgency going on in Iraq, and it's the Islamic State of Iraq, and it looks like they're at least at some kind of status quo or some kind of status level. My own experiences as a practitioner before I became an academic, I was helping tribal awakening units defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq. Actually, the Islamic State of Iraq, as Cole mentioned, by 2007. And what I realized reflecting back on my own experiences, that these were really fractured tribes that were allying with resistance groups that were turning against al-Qaeda, but mostly because they feared its power. It was a really tenuous alliance, so it didn't seem like it had a lot of staying power. And when you look at how the U.S. military looked at these particular tribal awakening units during the surge, it was certainly a means to their own ends, but not necessarily a lot of concern of what would happen to them after the U.S. kind of transitioned out, which it really shortly starts to do, at least in a combat role. So there's a lack of curiosity of what happens with Sunni politics with the Iraqi Islamic Party, which this Fallujah Memorandum document talks quite a bit about, them being a primary rival and someone that the Islamic State's quite fearful of, as well as the other resistance groups. And our mistakes on analyzing this stuff really do start in 2008, not after that. In the interim, I've studied the Islamic State of Iraq's counter-Sawa or tribal awakening assassination campaigns, done some research on that to understand what they were trying to do. They're trying to win, according to the Fallujah Memorandum, they're trying to win the tribes over, but at the same time, they have a pretty discriminate assassination campaign against tribal leaders that won't work with them. I've also studied their propaganda campaign to look, well, how do they message the fact that they're attacking Sunni Iraqis more than they are Shia Iraqis during this particular time period? And all of this is the rationale for it is laid out in the Fallujah Memorandum. So when you look at the Fallujah Memorandum, it starts with politics, which is that the Islamic State's got to work harder, do better to kind of unify the Sunni resistance against the Iraqi government, especially many of their rivals who haven't stopped fighting the government. They might have stopped fighting the coalition, but they weren't ready to really join the government in any fashion. And that space there, which you could argue could still exist today, is where the Islamic State was able to make a lot of headway in Iraq. And even though they are more successful in Syria, in 2013, it's that kind of fools people to think that the group didn't exist in Iraq and they went to Syria and they got strong and then they came back to Iraq, which I don't. The attack data, the activities, the Fallujah Memorandum, all of these documents kind of triangulate to tell us that there's a picture out there that we still really, as researchers and analysts, should pay more attention to, really get back into it. It's this focus on politics. And to me, it's not even simply the sectarian aspects or angles, but it's also the fact of what is the political objective of the Islamic State. It's to carve out a separatist state. And there's a lot of support for that from certain Iraqis who are not interested in reconciling with the government. And that's something we need to pay attention today. And documents like Fallujah Memorandum can help us with that.
So just to circle back on that, we are talking at AEI, which is a public policy institute. And, I think what I'm hearing from you is that the Islamic State recognized the friction between some of the military actions the United States was taking and the political gaps that we had. And this tracks a little bit with our policy that we're in there and assisting militarily with security forces and security assistance. But the local politics, the regional politics, the United States has been very hands-off because it's fundamentally not our problem. Is that problematic in how the US is framing it? Should we be more involved? Should we be trying to tie our security assistance much more to a political end state, or at least conditions?
I think it's a serial problem. From a strategic culture perspective, it's a serial problem of the United States that we focus not overly on the military aspect. These are military problems, but then once we've used our substantial power to create opportunity for something else to happen that's not militarily, we really don't have an understanding of how that operates, or that it's even, or who should be doing that. And so until we figure that out, and it goes back to even larger issues, larger than jihadism, the nature of this the strategic dilemma the United States has, which is we don't want to focus a lot of our power on containing these particular groups. We want to focus them on great power competition. But if we don't learn from this experience with dealing with really smaller threats, we're going to have a lot of trouble when we try to work with friendly countries or partners that are looking for U.S. military assistance or security assistance or training, and we're oblivious to the politics of why they might want it or what it will do for them. And that it's going to apply to great power competition, just like it does in how do we prevent yet another iteration of the Islamic State. So I think you're exactly right.
Super. So that leads me to Emily, whose research focuses on Africa. And when the Islamic State's predecessor, Al Qaeda in Iraq, was defeated back in 2007, 8, 9 timeframe, there wasn't really another part of it that was strong. But this time around, when the United States and its partners, particularly the Iraqis and then the Syrian Defense Forces and the Kurds, defeated the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State had branches elsewhere, and the strongest ones were in Africa. And so we saw a shift from both the Islamic State in terms of its emphasis on its African branches, and also, frankly, from the rest of the world as we're looking to defeat the Islamic State and looking at the African branches. How did the Islamic State discuss the African theaters before 2018, 2019, when it was defeated? And then how is it talking about them now? What is it doing now inside of Africa?
Thanks, Katie. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Africa perspective on the Islamic State. And I think Africa and the other more external theaters that outside of Iraq and Syria can be an interesting prism for looking at how ISIS's strategic culture plays out in different contexts, how things change as you get further away from the core. One useful way to look at ISIS in Africa is to think about its relationship to ISIS's overarching goals around legitimacy and resilience. Africa has been a place for ISIS to demonstrate the effectiveness and the attractiveness of its brand within the Salafi jihadi movement, to try and build some resilience against its losses elsewhere, and also to challenge Al Qaeda. So referring back to what Cole talked about a bit, the relationship between ISIS and Al Qaeda in competition to be the vanguard of the global Salafi jihadi movement. So going back before 2018, 2019, when ISIS was reaching its peak, at least in this iteration of ISIS, so looking at 2014, you started to see the presence in Africa as ISIS was trying to move from being focused in Iraq and Syria to being more global. So after the announcement of the caliphate in the middle of 2014, and then to the end of that year, and late 2014 was when ISIS started to accept the pledges of Bayat from external branches. So a few of those were in Africa, and then they kind of added some over the years since then. There is a spectrum of investment, how much ISIS core was interested in giving a lot of resources or leadership or guidance to these branches. At that point, so 2014 through 2016, the highest level of investment went to the branch in Libya, which became the group's more famous African branch at that time. So taking us back to 2015, ISIS was controlling a city in Libya that they marketed as the third capital of the caliphate alongside Raqqa and Mosul. So that was a big elevation for one of their peripheral branches. And it was discussed, so the Libyan city of Sirte that ISIS controlled at the time was discussed as a fallback option for potential loss of Mosul or of Raqqa. At the time, and especially in hindsight, that was an overstatement of how realistic it was that the ISIS project in Iraq and Syria could really fall back to Libya for reasons of distance and different conditions and all sorts of things. But the idea of a fallback option was rendered moot pretty quickly by end of 2016 when ISIS lost the city in Libya. And since then, there's been a decreased emphasis in ISIS media on Libya, which had been a focus. Broadening out a little bit, I also look at Africa as a theater for competition between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So if you look at where ISIS established affiliates, it naturally followed from where there was already a Salafi jihadi presence. And they had a mixed record of success with trying to build up affiliates or win defections from Al-Qaeda groups. One challenge that ISIS has faced in the African space is that the stronger of the Al-Qaeda affiliates, so Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM in North and West Africa, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia, were resistant to changing teams, essentially. So ISIS was able to get some splinter groups onto its side, but didn't kind of move the bigger affiliates over. Even with that limitation, though, ISIS was able to kind of proliferate affiliates across Africa that really amplified its appearance of strength at the time. Playing the clock forward a couple years, it's interesting to see, which of those affiliates have withered and which have strengthened. So, for example, the Algerian branch has almost stopped all activity, where the branch in the Sahel in Mali has gotten increasingly active. So some of the seeds that ISIS planted have flourished and others have not. Looking at the situation 2018 to now, ISIS has started to use its African branches as a counterweight to its losses elsewhere, and has also started to renew, even just in the last couple of months, an emphasis on competing with Al-Qaeda in Africa. So on the first point, there's a lot of media production coming out of ISIS's African branches, especially the West African branches that are very active. It's interesting to see it. Actually, the ISIS Reader book talks about Baghdadi's speech in April 2019, when he actually spoke in a fair bit of detail about the ISIS leader in the Sahel and about the Libya group. And he was demonstrating that he was still connected and leading actively, but that was also a big elevation for how much you hear about those groups in ISIS media. African affiliates of ISIS have continued to participate in coordinated media campaigns. So this past Ramadan, they were joining in a campaign called the Battle of Attrition that ISIS has claimed for the last few years. And last summer, ISIS announced a new province in Africa, the Central Africa province, which includes fighters in Mozambique and the DRC, which was a way of taking local groups that had pledged and using them to show continued expansion, remaining and expansion on ISIS's part. I might talk more about Mozambique later, but it's an interesting case where there's an ISIS affiliate that's actually following what appears to be some of the group's older methodology and appears to be having some success starting to contest control of cities and towns. The other major piece to watch right now is the fighting between ISIS and Al-Qaeda militants, Al-Qaeda-linked militants in the Sahel. So there's the AQIM affiliate, there's the ISIS affiliate. They've cooperated in the past and have actually been pretty closely related, but the last several months, there's been a lot of sustained fighting between those groups, and that's reflected in ISIS media too. So a recent statement from the ISIS spokesman focused on revenge against Al-Qaeda in Mali. And the reasons for that range from local territorial disagreements to the bigger issue of ISIS and Al-Qaeda's competition. So the Al-Qaeda group in that area is trying to pursue a model that Al-Qaeda is pursuing elsewhere, in part mimicking the Taliban deal in Afghanistan. That's a problem for ISIS if, as its model appears to be declining with the loss of the territorial caliphate, if the Al-Qaeda model is rising. And so Africa is one place where that dynamic is playing out, leading to more emphasis on ISIS's part on Africa than we had seen previously. At the same time, some of the ISIS groups in West Africa are also starting to adopt more of the brutality in attacks and in media that's associated with ISIS. as far as ISIS being kind of the more extreme of, among the extremist groups. So that theater of West Africa is going to continue to be important among the different places where ISIS and Al-Qaeda can compete as they enter kind of the next phase of leadership of the global Salafi jihadi movement.
Thanks. So I know your research has been in Southeast Asia as well. And when the Islamic State took over Mindanao and the Philippines, that was front page news, but now I don't hear about it at all. Are you seeing Islamic State attention to its branches out in Southeast Asia? Or what are you seeing? Is the Islamic State actually declining globally, or is it just in Iraq and Syria where we've seen the pressure militarily where it's declined?
Yeah, well, so many of the dynamics that Emily has kind of spoken about there, I've seen kind of to varying degrees over in Southeast Asia and the Philippines. So, and in the Philippines in particular, where I spend most of my time. I mean, until COVID, I was kind of traveling there every 6 months or so. And just for a little bit of background, I don't publish it all on the work that I do over there, but most of my work is focused on capacity building, working in community. So I've been traveling there since 2017, spent a lot of time in places like Iligan and Malawi, down in Cotabato, over in Zamboanga. These are these 3 really crucial channels of pro-Islamic State group activity in Mindanao. And so you have through that Sulu archipelago, those who kind of were aligned with the ASG, the FSAF group. You have the BIF in Maguindanao, and then you have the kind of the Daula in the Lanao del Sur. And the reason I provide that background is because from a distance, people kind of saw Marawi and they saw it as ISIS central reaching out into Asia, that it was part of this global expansion. There's almost this imperial power that was kind of moving around the world. The perspective that I have a lot of these dynamics is very much from a local perspective, just given the time that I've spent there. And from a local perspective, this was very much seen as a kind of a locally generated bottom-up exploitation of something that was going on over there, that the Maute Hapalon were taking advantage of, and it continues an ongoing kind of peace process in Mindanao, that these were these young upstarts trying to offer an alternative to the frankly very elderly leadership of the old revolutionary groups over that way, that they were exploiting organizational fractures, that those old allegiances and pledges to AQ, for example, in that Sulu archipelago, that this was a way for young up-and-comers to kind of distinguish themselves from that older school. And so from the locals' perspective, it was seen very much as kind of a locally generated phenomenon that was actually exploiting larger transnational kind of dynamics. Now, the reason why I think this is so important is because the way that we understand this phenomenon and the way that we think about how to support our partners in different regions has to reflect that reality. It has to acknowledge these local dynamics and kind of see that there is a bottom up and a top down interplay that's really important here. Moving forward, this is a relatively new issue for the Islamic State to deal with. That is managing its transnational kind of network. And it's new for Islamic State and happens to be new for strategic policy and academic thinkers as well. And I suspect that that there are a lot of kind of errors and missteps in the way that the field had thought about Al-Qaeda in this regard. And I would hope that we can kind of reflect on some of those lessons, some of the things that I think were misdirected, and not just kind of lazily apply the AQ template to what ISIS is trying to do in a transnational sense, but at the same time, not necessarily take ISIS history and use that as a template for how is going to try to manage this transnational network. Given where the group is at, given the problems that it has had, its global network, it gives it a lot of opportunities, but there is a lot of risks. And from a policy strategy perspective, we've got to work out ways to maximize those risks and to undermine those opportunities for it, and not see it necessarily as a one-way kind of street.
Thank you. Cole, as we're looking at the Islamic State going global and developing much more local roots, there inevitably introduces the problem of the ideology and ideological purity, if you will. You wrote recently about how some of the ideological challenges within the group actually weakened it. So I'm wondering whether, if you're looking ahead, how is the Islamic State going to deal with preserving its own ideological standing as it expands into a broader movement, both globally and deeper into populations?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the way I see it, the Islamic State's actually become more kind of ideologically purist than it has been in the past. I think you talked to me over email about the period of uncertainty and turmoil from sort of 2007 to 2011, having radicalized the group ideologically, and I think that's very much true. And when the split came with Al Qaeda in 2013, 2014, I think a lot of that just sort of opened the floodgates to ideological extremism. So you saw for the first time the Islamic State declaring that the Taliban was a group of unbelievers, where before it had been something that was celebrated as a good jihadi movement, even by Zarqawi, by the way. So there are differences even between ISIS kind of 2014, 2013 onwards and Zarqawi. It's become more extreme. And beginning in 2016, 2017, when the Islamic State began to kind of decline territorially in Iraq and Syria, I think that exacerbated a lot of internal tensions in the group. And one of those had to do with ideology, and particularly this doctrine of takfir, or excommunication, which stipulates that true believers must, as a rule, pronounce takfir on those considered unbelievers, and that those who fail to do so are themselves to be pronounced as unbelievers, which it sounds a lot better in Arabic, I promise. So basically, the scholarly class in the Islamic State tried to introduce a more nuanced position on this, so that people like Ayman Zawahiri, leader of Al Qaeda, could be understood as Muslims, and those failing to pronounce takfir on Zawahiri were not themselves to be labeled unbelievers. What happened though eventually is that though there was a kind of back and forth and a push and pull, the scholars lost, and they were either killed or they left the group of their own volition, and they try to make some noise, but ultimately they're not that, I think, influential today in the group. So the people who are left, the remnant in the Islamic State, are very much the most ideologically extreme. And that probably will have ramifications for the future of the movement. I'm not exactly sure how. It would seem that if it's going to appeal less broadly, it's going to appeal more narrowly to the most extreme type of Salafi Muslim in the world, that would kind of hurt its appeal. On the other hand, I see a lot of kind of whispering in the jihadi world that ISIS is actually becoming more popular, and that groups like Al Qaeda are fading in popularity. And so kind of the most extreme version of jihadism is on the up and up. So I don't see any reason to be happy about that. But it will possibly limit its appeal among a kind of more nuanced, thoughtful sort of potential recruit.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I think we're going to open up a little bit to questions, and we've got a couple now from Jeff Selden, who is the national security correspondent with VOA News. And Jeff has a series of questions, and I'll open them up to the panel so you can jump on these, but I think Craig might be best positioned to answer most. And the first one is both about the Iraqi military and the SDF, which have been conducting a steady stream of operations against Islamic State cells and operatives. Are these operations impactful, given the US estimates that the Islamic State still has between 14,000 and 18,000 fighters inside of Iraq and Syria? How much do we worry about the women and children in places like Al Hol and the camps where we have kind of large clusters of true believers being kept together. And then I'll follow up with the last question.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the first part, which is the military operations. I think, they look like they're making an impact. It seems a little belated because we've seen a slight rise in ISIS activity in Syria and Iraq. So it's a little reactionary. And I think, I'm sure that it's going to be effective in containing the group, but certainly it's not going to do what some people might hope, that it's going to destroy the organization, it's going to eliminate it. That's just not going to happen at this point. One, because they've routinized over time, they've become they've really got their organizational practices down through this ebb and flow that we discuss in the book. Their leadership succession has gone on flawlessly. They managed to hold on to these affiliates outside, which helps give them some legitimacy inside in Iraq and Syria, that everyone hasn't abandoned them. And then finally, they transitioned to this kind of uniform insurgency a lot earlier than we understood. And we were focused on the reduction of the caliphate for political objectives correctly. But we've got to be able to do two things at once, which is reduce the caliphate while you're also preventing them from reseeding an insurgency, which we kind of, it seems like they were successful in retrospect. It seems like they were successful in doing, right? In pushing caches out, in reseeding important people in important places, and being able to now restructure on the fly this organization to continue the fight, which is what all good insurgents do. Not all insurgents, but good insurgents figure out a way to perpetuate the fight until the political contradictions in the societies and regions around them collapse on themselves. So these operations that Jeff is, he covers these pretty regularly, and they're producing results, but they're not going to be at the end, substantial enough to do what we want them to do. Again, the question is going to be the politics.
And then taking his second question and putting it out to all of you, can you talk about the Islamic State's legacy? So I think that we've got a pretty good picture of the world right now on this panel. So what is the Islamic State's legacy? Has it scarred the region sufficiently so it's difficult, if not impossible, to move the region beyond the radicalism and violence, whether it's under the Islamic State or something else? So just talking about how the Islamic State has, going back to Harari's point at the beginning, actually started to shape the environment and change the conditions. What has it left behind, and what do you see going forward? Why don't we start with Emily, and then Harari, and we can end with Craig and Cole.
Sure. Look, looking at the questions, I think there are a couple interrelated things. One piece on ISIS's relative brutality and the way it's kind of playing out in competition with Al-Qaeda. I think it's most likely that what ISIS does in West Africa in particular is cause a kind of burst of activity initially, but then ultimately help legitimize Al-Qaeda as the relatively more moderate alternative. And I'm extra concerned about that, basically, because the Al-Qaeda groups are exploiting, they're kind of in a niche between two extremes now. There's a government that seems, or multiple governments seen as ineffective in local community dynamics that the group kind of tries to present themselves as solving. And then if you have ISIS moving to the far side, seen as more brutal, I'm concerned about in the longer term, large swaths of both Eastern and Western Africa where Salafi jihadi groups are effectively governing and putting their model in place at a level that falls a bit below Western policy attention, but also serves as a base for the components of the Salafi jihadi movement that do seek to attack externally as well. So I'm worried about that longer term. And to the question that Jeff also asked about women and children, I think there's a generational concern about communities that are growing up under like with Salafi jihadi governance as the model and the problem-solving mechanism. And so I think we have to start getting our heads around like the long-term implication of that as the model that has become familiar through the work of these groups to exploit the breakdown in local societies.
Aurora?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tendency, I think, for people to kind of say, as Craig will, well, I'm sure I'd be happy to mention, as they did in, say, 2008, 9, 7, 8, 9, to say, oh, look, they're too extreme, they're too brutal, they failed too much, never again. This movement doesn't have a chance. Look at what happened in 2014, 15, 16, 17. It's just not going to happen again. Well, those people are in for a really nasty surprise because this is a movement that has that I think what's really crucial here is this idea of competition and this idea of understanding that there isn't some perfect strategy, there isn't some idealized perfection that needs to be reached. You've just got to outcompete your competition. And because of all the dynamics which Emily, Craig, and Cole have spoken about throughout today's panel, because of so many of those dynamics, and frankly, the failure of the Islamic State's adversaries, perhaps particularly those of us in the West, to continue the non-violent fight, the political and the governance struggle, but also the equally complex, equally important psychological and social struggle after the fight. It creates room for this movement to settle itself once again and to exploit. They're very, very clear, really, in their definition of success. And it is a commitment to the manhaj. It's a commitment to this ongoing struggle and application. And at least Adnani in his final speech was very, very clear about that. So do you really think that you defeated us when you pushed us out about a decade ago? Do you think you're going to defeat us again when you push us out of these cities and back into the deserts again and you pursue us again? Again, I don't want to sound like an ISIS propagandist, but the answer to that question, as far as Adnani was concerned, was no, because we will remain committed. And so what happens is that the group tends to re-emerge where it emerged previously. That those same communities, it re-emerges again. Now, there's very obvious human strategic reasons for that. They know their networks are embedded in there. They know the streets. They can apply their operations with more confidence just because you know the area. But I also think it's important to recognise that there's a nostalgia lever that the group kind of pulls when we and when our partners fail in the post-fight struggle, the political and the governance in the political and governance theatres. And so it ends up kind of rewriting this history, which again was brutal and horrible and violent. But through messaging and through those activities, through building those networks again, they reshaped the way the population thought about that time. I mean, I saw this in Marawi months after the siege had ended. Already there were these narratives about, oh, imagine if we had been successful, imagine this, imagine that. And as the development inevitably fails, the reconstruction, rehabilitation fails, that messaging continues to gain resonance, and then it's reinforced by action. And before you know it, we find ourselves in the same position again.
Craig, do you have a quick reaction?
You're real quick, because I know we're short on time, and I'd rather listen to Cole, who's pretty smart on all this stuff. Plus, he's got that key to kind of whether I think, based on his past comments, whether the future of this movement going forward is really dependent a lot of times on their own issues, their own baggage. So I would offer that be happy to answer a lot of the great questions that I saw in the chat on your tag. your offer to continue the discussion on Twitter. So I'd be happy to jump in and answer some of those questions if you'd like to engage in that way. You know, the thing I've gotten wrong about this group in a lot of my research is how politically astute they are, and politically, it's not a way people look at this group. A lot of times they look at it from a terror perspective, or military, or governance, or whatever, or Sharia. The interesting thing, what I'd look really careful at is how do they scoop up the remnants of groups that are failing in Syria and Iraq, let's say tribal militias that are no longer of any use to the Iraqi government. That's happened before, who are working in Hashd al-Shabi or something like that. They are pros at picking up these cast-offs and then reincorporating them, which shows a level of pragmatism, because these people do not pass any kind of ideological test usually. So that goes back to Cole's point, right? Is if they can maintain, you know, bite their lip, which is what I've seen them do in the past, bite their lip and be pragmatic and expand, then they can be more successful in the future. If they can't, if they gets locked in the ideological box, as Cole talked about, they're done. So I'll pass it off to Cole, but I will definitely engage on Twitter with all of these great questions that came up that we just didn't have time for.
Cole, thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to address something I think Jeff Zeldin mentioned about whether ISIS has scarred the region sufficiently to kind of forestall a comeback. I think it's worth bearing in mind that ISIS isn't the only group in the region that's kind of brutalizing the populations. So I think a lot of particularly the Sunnis in Iraq, they see the Hashd al-Shabi, the PMF militias, and they see that as a greater threat to them and their livelihoods and their way of life than ISIS. And similarly, some of the people in eastern Syria, they don't want to be living under a group that's dominated by a Kurdish militia. So I think that there is a lot of room for ISIS to exploit kind of grievances. And it's crazy to think that the Islamic State hasn't sufficiently scarred the region, but I'm not sure that you know, the option isn't necessarily for a lot of these people political normality in the way that we enjoy it here in the United States.
Thank you. So I will reiterate Craig's note. I'll post some of these questions on the ISIS future hashtag, so that we can engage on that and you can see it as well. We've got a little bit under 5 minutes, so I just want to do a lightning round through the panel of what's coming next. Right, we're in the middle of coronavirus. The Islamic State has to deal with that, as do others. We have a new Islamic State Caliph who has been absent. So does who's in charge really matter at this point? Or is it the idea and the ideology that's driving this forward? And how much is the local interacting with the transnational? So 60 seconds to respond to all of that and work backwards. So Cole, starting with you, if you want to pick a quick response to wrap up.
Oh gosh. So I think the issue of the Caliph is very interesting. The man whose name we only know as Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi, who I believe is known, according to US government and Iraqi government sources, as Muhammad Saeed al-Mawla, who's of Turkmen origin. So it's interesting that that ISIS is not kind of personalizing the caliphate in the way that they originally did around Baghdadi. So they've definitely tried to lower expectations around whoever is the leader, and not to center the organization around any one individual. And I think that's strategically sound. It is a little odd that he hasn't given a speech yet, and that duty seems to have devolved exclusively onto the speaker of the Islamic State, the new speaker of the Islamic State, Abu Hamza al-Qurashi, whose identity I don't know. And the fact that hasn't hurt the Islamic State, and that we've actually seen its expansion during that period around the world, and an increase in attacks in Iraq and Syria during that time, leads me to think that perhaps we need to kind of reassess the importance of these individual leaders. It may be that they aren't that important, but it may be that behind the scenes, these are actually quite astute strategic thinkers. I'm not sure.
Haro, in 30 seconds.
Sorry, I used up my 30 seconds trying to get the cursor across. Look, I think that there are great opportunities here against the Islamic State. As with any opportunity, there are also risks. My concern is that there's a lot of distraction that's going on. You know, we're looking in different directions, and the key issue here is that I think, particularly from a policy perspective, is that we have to come to terms with how we deal with these types of threats within the context of the great power kind of competition, which is inevitably going to be the focus. And I think that's a big part of this. And I hope that perhaps the book may help people to kind of think about those issues in that context.
Great. Emily?
Just to build on that point, I think one thing to watch for is how the pivot to great power competition not only takes focus away from these counterterrorism issues, but also can actively get in the way. So I always have to flag Libya as one of my favorite things to talk about, but the way that that war is playing out makes it not just difficult, but in some cases counterproductive to pursue counterterrorism. So we shouldn't be surprised when we see groups that we thought were so weakened by counterterrorism pressure that they wouldn't come back actually start to resurface in those kind of chaotic environments in the coming years.
And Craig, last word of wisdom.
Yeah, just the leadership aspect. Leadership is tremendously important to insurgent groups, militant groups, and you know, again, looking back at the history of this organization, you see this pattern developing on leader succession, which, you know, Cole hit on, but he's kind of questioning why would anyone do that. And this group has done this with their previous leaders who were important people in their organizations, but ended up, to us, they're anonymous, and they deliberately depersonalize the position in order to make the position much more important. And Haror and I have written about that a lot, but it's fascinating to watch it play out and as Cole, you know, notes how they can get away with that in an age that seems very much about personalities, right? So that's really interesting from a strategic leadership perspective, I think, and that's I think it contributes to the longevity, and it's something we should try to better understand, because we don't. I mean, you can tell we just don't get it, and we don't understand why. Abu Bakr, I think, went 2 years before he gave his first speech as the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq. He gave a brief obituary or a brief eulogy for Osama bin Laden, and it was very short. See, you know, if pattern holds, we will not hear from Abu Ibrahim for quite some time until they start seeing some success.
Well, thank you all for your time. That wraps up an hour on the Islamic State. I think we all could have stayed here actually all day and talked further about this. I look forward to engaging with you on the hashtag ISISFuture. Thank you to our panelists, Craig, Cole, Hararo, and Emily for joining us here at AEI. And thank you for your time.
Thanks for being a great host. It's a privilege.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.